you know, walking around and, you know, touching and feeling, you know, the land, the water, and seeing all the live activity. It's one of those experiences that, you know, you can take back to your grandchildren and say, oh, this is what Papa Neville told us today.
Kia ora tātou. I'll just give a brief outline of the history of this lake. For us of Ngāti Hauiti, it starts with a tupuna named Matangi. Matangi lived in the Wairarapa. He'd heard of the large number of tui that were seen on the western side of the Tararua ranges, and he climbed to the top and he looked down and he saw this huge flock of tui, whirikoko, and he followed them up the Rangitīkei River, naming places as he went. By the time he got here, he was so tired that he knew he couldn't carry on any further. The birds decided to settle here in this area as well, and he made a home for himself just behind these trees. There's a flat area of land. My great-great-grandfather said that when he was a boy he saw the remains of Matangi's home over here behind these trees. My great-great-grandfather was active in this area from the mid-1800s. So it was probably 200 years prior to that Matangi came into this area. Before he left to travel back to the Wairarapa, two of his children, who he asked to fetch water from the lake, refused him, and they subsequently were left here as kaitiaki. You see all the raupō growing in clumps around the lake. When I was a boy, these things used to be moving around the lake. Each time you come down, they'll be in different places. And our oral history is that was two of his children, Hine, Te Iwiwa, and Horota, floating across the lake, trying to find a taonga that he had told them would be in the lake. When there was a downpour, the lake would rise up, and it was then that the only outlet from the lake would start to flow. And that was the only opportunity the mature eels had to get away to spawn. And there'd be just hundreds of eels just rolling over one another, waiting for the water to start flowing. As soon as a little trickle of water would head out towards the river, they would start moving. And I'm talking about the 1950s, early 1950s.
Believe it or not, I've only ever heard about Lake Oporoa in the last 4 years since our Ngā Puna Rau project started around about that time, because this is on private land. It's a shame because a lot of people would not have heard of this lake. If we were to go to some of our own whānau and say, today, this is where I went. If I was to show them the photos, they'll say, first thing is, where's this? Yeah, so it's a treasure that's been hiding.
Horizons are working with Ngāti Hauiti here on Oporoa to improve water quality with the vision of restoring the habitat for native freshwater fish such as eels or tuna. Horizons' role consisted of poisoning the poplars as they were having a detrimental impact on the lake quality, and the manuka that's been planted under those should grow up and replace the poplars and the functionality that those poplars were put there in the first place, which was for stabilisation. I think in 5 years' time we could start to really see the emergence of the kakatea that's been planted in there, and some of the other riparian species such as the titoki. And in the spring it's going to be really beautiful when the kōwhai starts to flower. The core samples taken by the Lake 380 team will give us a really clear picture of what the lake was like prior to those poplars being planted, and it'll work as a baseline for future monitoring of water quality.
And we can see that it's got lots of little chunks of, looks like wood chips and bits and things like that. That's the bits of broken up leaves, probably from the poplar trees that have been coming in over the years. And we can see that there's a good chunk of that sort of mud in there, and it sort of goes down about 10 centimetres or so. So that probably represents the time frame that those poplars have been growing and putting the leaves into the lake and things like that. As we go down through the core, we can see that there's a colour change at the bottom, and that's getting into some more brown mud that's probably likely to have a bit more clay and soil in it, and that could be at a time frame where there might have been maybe less vegetation in the catchment, and maybe when some of the trees were first felled and some of the farming could have been starting. It's hard to tell. So with the analysis that we'll do on here, we'll be able to understand its history, how its water quality has changed, how its health has changed through time. And this is basically the lake telling its story. Neville, when we took the cores out, and you can see through the side of them a little, there were lots of little flecks that looked like wood chips, little wood chips, and that's actually a lot of the leaf litter from the poplar trees that were growing there. Those trees were planted in around 1970-75. You can see abrupt change here, you know, something's happened quite significantly there, and then it's changed again and changed again through there. So we can use the pollen from here to understand when humans first came into the landscape, and when the Europeans first came into the landscape. So this could be related to European impact. The cores come back from lake sampling to GNS science, where they come into our labs and are split. So one side of the core is set aside for our core scanning, and one side is set aside for our sampling. The hyperspectral scanning captures a detailed image and data of the sediment core. It provides us an indication of how much algae has been in the lake and in the mud, and how algae has changed through time. The subsampling is done centimetre by centimetre all the way through the core, and these samples are sent off for different analysis, such as analysing the algae trapped in the mud, or things like pollen to reconstruct the environmental history through time. In Lake Oporoa, we can identify when humans first arrived around the lake. There is evidence in things like charcoal as an indicator of that there might have been some burning around the lake at the time, and also some changes in the vegetation, things like bracken fern, which is often associated with people modifying the landscape a little bit. We can understand and identify when Europeans have came into the landscape. We see the increase in species associated with farming and agriculture, such as grass species, but we also see the increase in exotic tree species such as the willow, the pine, the poplar trees. The analysis of the cores that we've taken from Lake Oporoa have revealed some interesting things. We've got evidence from some of the cores around the lake edge of kowhai seeds. And I think that's really neat how it connects with the idea that the tui in Matangi's story, you know, Matangi was following the tui to Lake Oporoa, or that's where they rested, and probably were feeding on the kowhai tree at the time.
Those times we've been at Lake Oporoa, do you ever think, what did this place look like? What did this place sound like? What did it smell like, you know? What did the water taste like when Matangi first came to it? Do you ever get pulled back into that memory, deep memory?
You know, the story around the Matangi following the flock of birds up. I just think, you know, the catchment would have looked way different, you know, clothed in natives and kowhai, and picture the lake being clear and full of tuna, and the outlet stream sort of winding its way down to the river and the different wetlands that sort of cascade down to the river. Just an abundance of life. When Matangi first walked into this area, there's no tracks, no roads. You know, it would have been a hard journey, but you know, it would have been, yeah, beautiful. And every time I go to the lake, it's like, you know, it's like a
seeing it again for the first time. So I think, it's beautiful now. I can't imagine how beautiful it would have been, a couple of 100 years ago.
One interesting observation from Lake Oporoa is the history of raupō at the site. It was really quite unique to be able to identify that part of the environmental history matching the oral history of Matangi and his visits to Lake Oporoa, and the raupō history related to his children. And we see that the pollen of raupō only increases and becomes abundant as we see evidence of Mauri entering the landscape. And that's a really unique and interesting fact.
Uses for raupō were 1 for insulation and 2 for, rafters. The stems were used as rafters. Raupō is still in our whare tūpuna whiti kaupeka at Marae. The other traditional use that I know of is they used the pollen of the raupō to make bread called pangapanga, and also to make a form of what we'd call cakes today. I've never tried it, don't know if I want to try it.
Enhancing the Mauri of Lake Oporoa has been a big focus of the work we've been doing, but in tandem with that, some of the really important work has been around strengthening those social and cultural links back with the lake as well, not only for the iwi but the local community, because for a lot of people they don't know the lake, so if they don't know it, it's hard to get them to care about it. It starts to pull on the heartstrings once you understand, maybe how bad a lake's got or how important this lake might have been in history and the cultural connections you have with that lake. You can have all the science and the mātauranga, but we need the people to drive it, to care, to take all that knowledge and try to come up with solutions. So the people part of all of this is really crucial.
Our relationship with the team from Lake Australia, it's a whole new side of the mahi that we entered into that we didn't really have a true understanding of. And you can see the excitement from our people. We're going to be able to go back in history and learn in depth about exactly what our lake looked like, what the health of the lake was, what we can learn to be able to get our lake back to what we want it to be.
The storytelling from your results are going to be with us for life. That's the best part of it. Those are things that they'll be with us for all our life, and the kids will have great access to all those findings and how their nannies and their koros went out and looked at the lands and thought, well, how can we improve this for many, many generations?
I didn't realise how big it was, first and foremost. And obviously teeming with life, some life you don't want there, like the geese and so on. But we knew that we could do something really positive for the lake. So it gave us a sense of urgency.
My great-grandfather came home with a sack over his shoulder on his horse. And he said, "What have you got in there, Pop?" He said, "Oh, I've got a pig." And he threw it down and out slithered this great big eel, 42 pounder.